So hi, I'm Nick Turner. I'm the director of Vera. I'm really looking forward to moderating this conversation. This is a conversation about safety-driven responses to violence. Everyone has the bios of folks who are up here, so we won't bother to repeat them. I'm going to say that this is going to be a hard panel. I don't know, David, Laura, and Eric, if you all had the opportunity to sit and listen to the previous panels. But the panels before us were deeply moving, and we talked about shame and forgiveness and restoration and empathy. And they were powerfully human. And in many respects, we are going to try to maintain that powerfully human discussion, but also talk about system change, because all of you represent, in one way or another, individuals who have committed yourselves to changing the system of justice, the so-called system of justice that we have in this country, and that is, there's different language that operates there, and in a way there's a very different mindset. So what I'd like to do to begin is just to tag an idea that everyone in this room knows. It has been repeated already a number of times, which is that we kind of know how it mostly works in America. America has a particular brand of punitiveness, and that has produced a formula for how we deal with violence, and that is, most simply put, that we extract violent people from our communities, from society, and we lock them up for a long, long time. And that is, in a way, mother's milk, although I see from my experience here that not too many people have been drinking from mommy here in this particular room. But, broadly speaking, in society, that is really the way many people think about this issue. And so I want to ask a general question, and then I'm going to just ask you all to respond to it. So let me just put it out there, which is, is there validity to this approach? And can we here on the panel talk about the ways in which we can effectively promote safety that expand our solution set, that don't rely on incarceration? And as Marlon asked at the tail end of the last panel, he asked the question, which is whether it is possible to have accountability and mutually exist with mass incarceration. And those of you who were here obviously heard those answers. So without further ado, Eric, if I could turn to you as the acting district attorney in Brooklyn. Your mission as a prosecutor is in part to produce safety, or maybe in whole to produce safety. And I'd like to know if you see incarceration as the only way to do that, and if you do, or if you don't, tell us a little bit about why.
Good morning, everyone. So the answer, in short, is absolutely not. I do not believe that incarceration is the only way or the best way to secure public safety. Public safety being an important part of my job. Obviously, the people of Brooklyn want to be safe, as do people from all communities. But I perceive my fundamental role as prosecutor to make sure that the criminal justice system is fair. And so I believe it's fairness, and through fairness we can achieve public safety. We have a history in Brooklyn of working with common justice. And so in Brooklyn, we've taken the approach that we can have it all. We can have public safety, we can have a fairer criminal justice system, and we can reduce our over-reliance on incarceration. So we've worked with Common Justice and with Danielle to do something that most DAs in the state of New York don't do, and probably across the country, is we work with people who've been charged with violent felony offenses and look at programming and therapy and counseling and different analysis of what accountability looks like to try to transform lives and to put people back into communities. Because I will tell you from my own life experience, and this is where I think I differ from many other prosecutors. I grew up in East New York in Brooklyn during the 80s and 90s, so I've witnessed the impact of criminal justice on my friends, my family members, my community. My family was a victim of a horrific crime. My brother was killed, shot, so I have that as a crime victim. But I also have the sense of remembering what it felt like as a young man walking down Pennsylvania Avenue to get to the train and always having this insecurity, would I get there safely? So I wanted to be involved in shaping it, but I realized that we're never going to incarcerate ourselves to safety, and we're never going to change our communities by only putting people in prison. And most people don't go to prison for very long times. They go in for shorter stays, and people realize they come back out without the skills and with having suffered so much while they're inside. And that's not good for our families or for our communities.
Eric, you've told me about where you grew up. I didn't know that about your brother. I'm curious, but it's now how many years that you've been a prosecutor? 20.
I'm in my 22nd year.
So have you evolved? I mean, has your thinking about the role that the prosecutor plays and what accountability means and what fairness and safety for people mean? I mean, have you seen evidence that has helped you to change your view, or is that very much how you began your career?
No, I think like many young prosecutors, you begin your career and you're put into a system. I knew I wanted to be a prosecutor from the time I was in college, and I went to law school to become a prosecutor. But when you enter into a district attorney's office, and the Brooklyn DA's office was a progressive district attorney's office in comparison to others, it's still the metrics of how you're judged as a prosecutor is, how effectively you plea bargain, how many trials you conduct, your win-loss ratio, and can you win difficult trials. And so much of what and how you're judged as a prosecutor is, can you convict someone? So the transformation of district attorneys' offices has to start with that metric. And so one of the things that I've been talking about to my staff and trying to push is that the metric is about how many lives you save and how many chances you create for public safety that don't include incarceration and don't include the metric of wins and losses. And I've been changing even the way we're going to evaluate assistant district attorneys. Are they contributing to their community? That's going to be a factor in sort of the evaluations of prosecutors. Do they get involved? One of my really pet peeves, I guess would be the way, is that as a young person, I never saw a prosecutor in my community unless someone was a victim of a crime or they were being accused of a crime. And I often challenged who was making the decisions on behalf of the people of my community, because I didn't see anyone who looked like me in those positions of making decisions. And so you have to have skin in the game, I believe. And so that's one of the factors, and I think my assistant DAs, they need to be involved in the communities they serve. Otherwise, I don't think they can understand what the community actually wants. And when we talk about what victims want, you have to be engaged with your community. So when an assistant comes and wants to plead out a case, the first question I ask them, have you reached out to the harmed party? Have you spoken to them? Where are they at in the handling of this case? So I say all that to say that I have evolved because I came through a system that really judged me on could I win a trial, could I secure convictions, and I'm trying to change that within the office, that culture. And that's a culture that needs to change in other prosecutors' offices as well.
Thank you, Eric. It's good to hear you talk about that change, not just personal, but also within the system as a whole. David Kennedy, I wanted to ask you a question. I'd like for you to talk a little bit about the work that you do and how law enforcement, the work that you're doing specifically with law enforcement, and how you approach the attainment of safety through the national network. But I'm also curious to know whether you can tag this onto a conversation that we had earlier in the day. And DeMario was talking about his experience of of being jumped with his best friend, and he said, should we call the police? And his friend said, for what? And that was deep on multiple levels. He then talked about, this sort of locating oneself in the time and space continuum, and of remembering as a kid seeing Wolfman, this cop, beat someone while he was busy playing football, and then also talked a little bit about history. So how do you even begin to unpack the idea of law enforcement delivering safety in that kind of context?
Okay, I will answer that. So, but first, I have to say this. If you've been downstairs to go to the bathrooms, there's little first aid stations down there. On the first aid station.
Is the mic, is David's mic on?
Hello, hello. Thanks. That's better. So on the first aid stations, there's an open box of these little towelettes that are anti-static, anti-glare wipes for your glasses, and there's another one of Advil. And so somebody has figured out that the real working slogan for our movement is see clearly and self-medicate, right? Because that's how it works. Okay, I had to get that out. So I was going to take mad advantage of Demario. Is he still here? Because that was so helpful in so many ways. So I'm a little bit of a researcher in the work that I do, and I think there's some facts here that matter. And Nick, let's begin with what you said, which is the way we deal with violence is to take dangerous people out of the community and put them in boxes. That's true for the dangerous people we take out of the community. What we need to start with, I think, is the fact that almost no dangerous people in the community get taken out of the community. So we work in international circles, and we are really snotty about what's going on in Mexico and Honduras and the Northern Triangle, right? And we say these are places where the state cannot provide security and where the people do not trust the state and do not want the state's help. And the state is often the source of much of the violence. It's actually state-deployed violence. It's police violence. When people are harmed or at threat, they go to self-help, they go to self-action, they get guns and their friends, they deal with this stuff themselves, and that leads to the pattern of retaliation and vendetta that drives the violence, and these are failed states. Hello? Right? The neighborhoods that I'm committed to are failed states, right? Every single thing that I've just said is true about West Garfield Park in Chicago. And one of the results of that is something that we really ought to take as impunity, even for gun violence, right? So David Bernstein is a reporter in Boston who's just done a new analysis over about 3 years in Boston. The clearance rate for gun homicides in Boston over that period is 15%. And the clearance rate for non-fatal shootings is 4%. We are living with impunity. People get away with even that kind of violence. And if we stop talking about people shooting each other and we talk about domestic violence and sexual assault and child abuse, we are dealing with impunity. So that's all we need to know that everything else that we do as a system response cannot work, right? We cannot address community violence when the structure of the system engages with that small a part of what's really going on. Two, again, taking advantage of DeMario's comments and others who said very similar things. What's driving impunity is the lack of legitimacy that the state has in the community. So we talk about the police. This is not just the police. What we're really talking about here is the deployment of the power of the state in our communities. And the community does not like the way the power of the state is being deployed. It knows it has done harm. It does not expect help. It does not want, the why is a really good question. We don't want what is being offered. So it's not asked for. This is a matter of history. This did not start with Ferguson, right? It started with the founding of the nation and transportation and slavery and Jim Crow and separate but equal and everything that we all know happened. And to take advantage of DeMario again, we really have to respect how we have gotten to where we are. So one of the things that we think is really possible and that we've been working with Fatima and others in this room on, I think, and many of us think, that reality requires frank, formal reconciliation work. And part of reconciliation work is a structured recognition of how we got where we are, what it has meant, and the harms that have come out of it. And I don't believe that any kind of structural or policy and practice reform going forward can deal with the community experience of being harmed under color of law by the nation, right, which is in fact what we're talking about. And then when it comes to what we do when we lock people up, we know that it doesn't work and that it can't work. So we know that almost all of the talk about criminal justice responses to violence and the conversation around prison focuses on the severity of sanction. And even in the reform movement, so much of the conversation is about severity of sanction. So that's an important conversation. When it comes to actual prevention of violence, when we know how deterrence works, that will not deter, right? The way deterrence works is overwhelming through certainty, and we do not have certainty. Next, through swiftness, we don't have swiftness, and severity matters almost not at all. So we're putting all of our energy into exactly the wrong place, even in traditional criminal justice terms. We know that being incarcerated doesn't bring reform or affect recidivism, any of those things. And as per this last panel, we know the public talks about prison as if it were accountability. It's not accountability. It's a lot of things, and one can make a case for punishment and retribution and such if one wants to, but those are not accountability. Accountability is internal and cannot be imposed, and there are different ways of producing accountability. So none of that can work, right? We just ought to understand that very clearly. And then you did actually ask me a different question, which I will now try to answer. There are things that work around the prevention of community violence. So far, what all of them involve are kind of customized stitching together of various sorts of resources and focusing them in what end up to be fairly common sense ways on the very small number of people in communities who drive at least public violence. We talk about these, many folks do, as bad places full of bad people. They're not. They're good places with a few traumatized and highly stressed and scared and vulnerable people in them. And what has worked is to gather together community resources and service resources and law enforcement resources and engage respectfully with those small networks of people. And you all know this, there's various versions of this. There's the Operation Ceasefire stuff that I've been part of. Gary Slutkin's here. It's another way of focusing on those folks, their dynamics in a very micro, real-time way. And we know now that one can make a really big difference on the ground. If that kind of work were hooked into system and structural elements that were doing less harm and were built on the kind of notions that everybody's been talking about today, we could surely do a much better job if people thought that the state was in a better place, it would get more respect and it would get more cooperation, and if we did less harm, we'd all be better off.
Thank you, David. David Muhammad, I want to turn to you because David just pointed this direction. Dr. Slutkin, and you've had experience both in, I think, doing work for in a ceasefire context as well as a cure violence context. And David Kennedy talked a little bit about a changed approach to how law enforcement approaches his work in communities like West Garfield. But does from your view, does law enforcement always have to, are there other strategies of engaging violence and reducing it that do not necessarily rely upon law enforcement as a mechanism to do so?
Sure. So first, this is a complicated, complex, and difficult set of issues and discussion, right? And so when we're talking about violence and people losing their lives, we had the mothers who've lost their children on an earlier panel. This is difficult stuff, right? And what America has known is plucking people out that we've figured out or we think are the perpetrators of violence and putting them in institutions. But like David said, the clearance rate, the rate upon which we convict, arrest, and convict people of crimes is pretty low, actually, of very serious offenses. And so incarceration in and of itself is ineffective, harmful, and excessively expensive, right? It doesn't work, it makes you worse, and it costs too much. And when we know that is true, but yet continue to use it, that's insanity. Right? And so, but we have had discussion on other panels about this agreement. The way I would describe it is people who are a legitimate risk to the public safety do need some time out of the community, right? Now, that needs to look extraordinarily different than what we do right now, but it also needs to happen to an extraordinarily smaller number of people. Because the people who we could say are really a risk to the public safety is a small fraction of the number that are currently in the criminal justice system. We spend about $80 billion a year to incarcerate folks. How much could we better use those resources to build community, to help families, to build individuals? One injury shooting costs about $1 million each. Right? When you think about fire response, ambulance response, police response, a trial, an incarceration, a hospitalization, possibly an autopsy, a funeral, right? All those costs combined are about $1 million. Those are direct costs, not including the indirect costs of loss of work for perpetrator or victim, right? And so a lot of money being spent on harmful, ineffective practices, right? And so the pretext to the answer and what has been proven effective is, in one sense, to make it incredibly basic, is identification and intervention. Extremely basic. Identify those individuals who are highly likely to be involved in violence, either as perpetrator and victim, and as we know, they often look extraordinarily similar, right? And then intervene. What we currently do is intervene very ineffectively with law enforcement and harmful and expensive. But what we have seen in pilots in small places here and there in Boston, Chicago, Oakland, neighborhoods in New York, is that we can identify people correctly who are very highly likely of being involved in the shooting and then have an intervention that is not a law enforcement intervention, right? Whether we use credible messengers, people who have similar backgrounds and shared experiences of the folks that they want to engage, who can have an impact, right? And so cure violence in Chicago has been replicated in many places around the country and the world. In fact, Operation Ceasefire, which has been born in Boston but replicated around the country with significant effect and success. Hospital response, when folks who have been shot, you dispatch credible messengers to the hospital to engage with them and their family to try to stop retaliation, and then Office of Neighborhood Safety Fellowship. These, what I call 4 proven ways, 4 proven methods, will all have very similar basic data-driven identification of who is most highly at risk, which is a small number of people, intervene with them, right? Communicate that they are in risk, respectfully and directly, and offer support, right? And that support doesn't mean we're going to connect you with a job, we're going to connect you with drug treatment. It should have that, but many folks aren't at that point, right? We're going to connect you with a relationship, So I could have just answered relationship to your question, Nick, but because the short version is a healthy relationship with a positive adult, right? And once they've been identified, the intervention is that relationship. So I want to be in relationship with you. I want to have a trusting relationship with you. And then when you're ready, I can connect you to a job. Then when you're ready, I can connect you to what needs you have. But right now, I want to be in relationship with you, right? So that when you have a crisis, or when you have an issue, or when you're stressed, you can call me. Right? And it doesn't require that you're going to job program X or cognitive behavior therapy program Y. It doesn't require that, right? And so what in New York, the Arches program, what we call transformative mentoring done by credible messengers, has been extraordinary, right? I've had the pleasure of helping introduce that concept when I was a deputy commissioner of probation here, and has taken off like wildfire, right? So the last thing I'll say is back on cost. So it costs about $1 million per injury shooting. And we are okay with that when that includes plucking someone out and incarcerating them for long periods of time. In the small city of Richmond, California, they tried this innovative program, identified the highest risk individuals and intervened with them, and said, we're going to give you $1,000 a month for 9 months so that you can be in relationship with a life coach, with a neighborhood change agent. And people lost their mind. Right? You're going to pay criminals to behave was the headlines, right? Now, despite the extraordinary success and the reduction in violence there, right, by using some of these same principles of cure violence and Operation Ceasefire, and to say, we're going to get your attention, right? And the quick story, bear with me. So Devon, my friend and colleague, who we helped create the Office of Neighborhood Safety, and he ran it. I always say, I created it, but I didn't think of the fellowship, but I'll take credit for it. But so he was in a meeting with law enforcement, and they talked about small Richmond's only 100,000 people, right? They said there's only 25 people responsible for 75% of the violent crime. And his law enforcement officer after law enforcement officer said it. He said, well, wait a minute, send me the names of those 25 people. Right, 5 agencies sent him separately 25 names. There were about 27 common names on the list. He called all of them to a meeting and gave all of them in that first meeting a $1,000 check, right, and said, we want you to connect with the neighborhood change agent, all formerly incarcerated, credible messengers who had similar lived experiences. And they started from that point. People are incensed that $9,000 would be spent to stop a $1 million incident and change life in the process.
Laura, I want to turn to you, but and let me just say to the audience that if you all have questions, please write them down on card and send them up in this direction. And with about 5 minutes to spare, we'll get to a few of them. But so, Laura, you work in Michigan. You are working on what many people describe as the back end of the system, parole reform. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that, because I think, in a way that you're trying to correct this. This failed state that we have that has imposed long sentences as a response to violence. And one of the things that resonated earlier today for me was that, more than a few people said this, but in different words, that what we should be asking of survivors is, how were you harmed and what do you need? And I'm curious to know whether you find any kind of resonance in that, and if you actually deploy that question in your work on parole reform, if it's possible, or if it's way too late to even have that conversation because we're talking about acts that were committed a long time ago.
Well, first of all, I want to say I'm really honored to be part of this, and I consider everyone who went before my teachers. We are learning. I've been involved in criminal justice reform for about 40 years. I'm an elder here, but I'm a student. So we're learning new ways to approach issues of criminal justice reform, and I think the opening provided by the experience of crime survivors is going to make addressing people who have committed assaultive crimes, their sentencing and parole, a positive outcome. It's the only way to answer. You can't answer a safety question with just a cost question or just data. You have to answer a safety question with a better safety solution. And that's what all of you have laid out today. We know that long prison terms have a reducing, that recidivism declines. There's no public safety payoff in the way that we traditionally talk about public safety by measuring recidivism. We know by research that people who've committed sex offenses and homicides have very low recidivism rates. You may be surprised. I'll talk to you about the data later. In interest of time, I won't. But very low recidivism rates. That doesn't square with the public perception that these are dangerous individuals, irredeemable, and we should throw away the key, and that's in the best interests of everybody's safety. So we have the data, but we don't have the hearts and the minds. And there's a tremendous investment in business as usual, of saying, I'll be tougher, I'll keep you longer, I'll keep the back door shut, and you're safer. The problem with the traditional approach, and we use it, we do extensive research, we can quantify the impact of longer sentences and the very low recidivism rates, is it doesn't do a couple of things. It doesn't address the problem of risk being unequally distributed. In other words, some of us live in very safe communities, taking advantage of the decline in the crime rate, and some of us don't. We're all at risk, but some of us have more risk than others, and those are largely concentrated communities of poverty and communities of color. Secondly, it doesn't address the sense that something is wrong, and there's no real answer to incarceration, except that we did a survey that our partner, the Alliance for Safety and Justice, helped us do in 2015, and we found in a survey, statewide survey of folks, that the top interventions had nothing to do with incarceration. Mental health, 80%. Helping juveniles, huge. Crime survivor trauma healing, 65%. This was just a general survey, including Republican, white, rural guys, who still went this way on the survey by majorities. Not as big as majorities, the whole survey, but by majorities. The lowest ranked response to what will keep you safer was prison at 34%. The public, as well as crime survivors, know our solutions are inadequate. They know they're being bled dry, but they believe that that's the only way out. And part of that belief is that those in prison for assaultive offenses, and in Michigan, we've gotten rid of we reformed the drug laws, we plucked the low-hanging fruit a long time ago. We have to, in order to really decarcerate, we have to address people who've committed assaultive offenses. As long as those persons are the other, and that otherness rests on our long history, which has been discussed before, structural racism, but also the belief that you and I are not alike. You are dangerous, and I have to be protected from you. As long as we're stuck with recidivism stats and keeping the head engaged, we're not going to get that public will moving forward to really decarcerate. And I think the framing that we've heard here today, the healing conversation, the wisdom out of the communities are the key to opening up that toolbox of how we address crime and violence beyond these discussions that ratchet back and forth between how long, sort of these technocratic discussions of should it be 10 years or 20 years? Should you parole people who've done X? Yes, we have to do our due diligence. We have to protect people within the system we have until we can change it. But we don't have a vision in general of moving forward that is based out of the communities, based out of crime survivors' experience, and that's where we want to go and think we have to go.
Thank you, Laura. So there is one question from the audience. So as everyone I think knows here, and just yesterday the governor signed the bill to raise the age of juvenile jurisdiction here in New York from 16 to 18. Don't clap too soon, people, because sorry. It excluded 16 and 17-year-olds, or a portion of them, who have committed violent crimes, keeping the jurisdiction up at Supreme Court. But so the question is does this signal that we remain addicted to antiquated thinking about violence? And here's one thing that I would love for anyone to answer, but sort of weave in your thoughts about this, which is that we have already, Eric talked about his beliefs as a chief prosecutor in Brooklyn. Many people probably saw in the newspaper 2 weeks or so ago, Aramis Ayala, a prosecutor in Orlando, said that she was not going to pursue the death penalty, and boy, did they come after her. The political machine, like got up and muscled up and came after her. You, David Muhammad, talked about choices made in Richmond and this revulsion, the response to something that was common sense, but probably not intuitive to many people. So there is policy and there's politics. So someone on this panel, help us understand whether this is a sign that we remain addicted to old thinking about violent crime, or how do we think about how to move forward in a world where politics is so pronounced?
Yeah, go ahead.
I was take a quick first stab. I think that, first of all, we just don't understand how things work often, right? And so we think about probation. I've been a correctional administrator, ran nonprofits, and then I turned to the dark side of the force for a while. I'm back. I'm back out. And we don't think about how things. Quick story. I remember I took the superintendent of a school district in the Bay Area in California to a juvenile facility. Now, she was an advocate. She's run the school system, and the largest number of people in this county facility came from her school district. And it was the first time that she had a normal human response. She was horrified. This was one of the better juvenile facilities in California. And she was horrified, as a human being should, to see this is what we're doing with children. Right, and people so there is a cognitive dissonance around how we administrate the justice system. Two other quick points. One is around the raise the age in New York. Just a quick piece. One, the so-called serious offenses were excluded. But the other thing, there was a quiet, I wouldn't say opposition, but a quiet championing this issue by some public defenders, because the way the juvenile system runs in New York is a lot more paternal and very much, so you'll have probation conditions that say, go to school every day, go to every class, right? And for a young person who hasn't gone to school in 2 years, right? And if you don't go to every class, you're in violation of your probation, right? Where on the adult side, some of those offenses you wouldn't even be seen. There's been so much kind of reform. We're not there yet, but there's been so much reform in New York, state and city, that a lot of offenses that are deeply touching the juvenile system, we're not even touching on the adult system. So that's just something to be aware of, right? So that beware of what you ask for in certain instances. Last thing I'll say is this notion of how we spend our money. And so in Oakland, California, there's this huge investment in this population. So Operation Ceasefire in Oakland, which has really expanded to have a really robust set of services and supports. We also have something called relocation. So we spend $200,000 a year just to relocate people who are in imminent risk of being involved in gun violence. So some of them were just shot, and somebody wants to finish the job, right? And so the one story I'll say, we had a young man shot 5 times. And he knew who did it, and he was not talking to the police. And he knew as soon as he got out that the person was going to be after him, and he has cousins in his ear saying, "Let's go get him before he gets you." Right? So we sent in one of these credible messengers to convince him to move to his sisters in Cleveland. Right? And so we had him picked up on discharge minute from the hospital and put on a plane. Right? And paid for him to move to Cleveland, and gave his sister 3 or 4 months of living expenses money for him. Right? And the government paid for that and saved some lives in that process. And this person was a reputable gang member who had a record, and we had to transfer his parole, a whole bunch of stuff, right? But we went through that process of paying for him, transferring his parole, so that we can save lives. It cost a few $1,000s. Not only was it the heart humane, but it actually was cost effective.
Thank you. Laura, take us home on this last question. You have a minute.
All right, let me say that CAPS is involved in pursuing safe and smart parole reform, which says the parole board should release people at their earliest parole date, that's after the court-imposed sentence has been served, unless they pose a current risk to public safety. We've defined the criteria. That's a big battle, but the public is ready for it. And they're ready to think about this differently. We have a significant amount of support from the business community. There is a workforce shortage in Michigan. They see this as a workforce development. People who've hired parolees talk about what great employees they are. That's a new voice. We've organized over 300 faith alliances statewide, including the Christian Coalition, which is a big advocate. So we're speaking to our conservative, white, Republican majority with voices they can hear, and we're reaching out to crime survivors with the help of ASJ and Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice to help ensure that their voices, their needs are being heard. This is a new work for us in terms of the organizing side and the crime survivor. We're learning, but I am convinced that this is the path for really addressing people who have committed assaultive offenses, addressing the needs in the community that have gone unmet, and for those of us who for a long time worked in this work as crime victims, and I would include myself in that, it provides this sense of, aha, we now know how to give voice to pain in a way that heals, and will move this forward, and the public is ready to listen.
Thank you very much. Round of applause for the panel, please. Thanks.